A lot of people have said to me, why on earth would you as a woman choose to respond to an all-male piece? Well, men have been telling women's stories for years. I didn't feel alien from it. I just felt that it was a story about fear and love. So I was interested to examine it and look at masculinity maybe with a slightly tender eye. It's a violent piece, but it's so much about humanity. So for the Glyndebourne Festival this year, I've chosen to focus on Billy Budd because I fell in love with the story and it felt very personal to me in a number of ways. My history in textiles means that my practice is one where I use clothing and I dress myself up and I take on a character. I think it goes back to my understanding of clothing and the power of clothing. And I like the idea of becoming someone else through clothing and using it to take, and it becomes less about portraiture, it's less about me. In fact, it's never really about me. So I love the fact that it's an easy way into that world of embodiment. At the time that this project came about, I had a bad accident with my back and I ended up having to have an operation, which was quite big and left me pretty much bedbound and then housebound for a really long period of time. And I related to the idea of being on a ship, this sort of sense of isolation and being separate from the world, but at the same time having my own world in my head. My house became my ship, and I sort of really related to Billy being kind of taken from one world and placed in another and having to readjust himself. So I think there's a very personal element to why I fell so in love with the story, both my physical state and also the ropes and all the textiles that were so embodied in Billy's story visually from looking at the production. I had to watch it on my computer screen because it's a revival piece. And the point at which I listened to it, I'd just come out of surgery and I was in bed. It was mad and powerful and emotional, and I just cried and cried and cried. I wasn't able to paint for 4 months after the operation, and I actually couldn't even draw because it affected my nervous system, and I couldn't go out and get materials, and I felt too overwhelmed to start going online and ordering things, so I decided to use what was in the house, and I felt this was an honest response because it felt like, well, I would use what was on the boat. If I was stuck on this world or that world, I'd use what's around me. When my grandfather died and I was about 19, I inherited a desk. It was his desk that he'd worked on all his life, and in the drawer was a stamp set. So I decided for the first time ever to try and work on it, and you had to put the little letters, which were on rubber, and place them into the holder for the stamp, and my hands were shaking so much that I couldn't kind of turn them to get them in properly. And I would listen to Billy Budd, and I had this beautiful piece of fabric that comes from, I think, France around 1920, and I decided to use this institutional bit of linen and to stamp on it, but it came out almost like a stammer because I couldn't put the letters on and I couldn't really control my hands. And all the way along the line, I applied rigour to making sure that I just focused on what I could focus on and let it lead me to the next point. So we've gone from stamps to a full photo shoot, which will enable the next stage of making, which will be where I put myself into the frame. So we've got drawing, printing, charcoal work, costume design, and obviously I've worked with Glyndebourne and been able to use their costumes, which I've used as both a sort of reference point mentally, but also to shoot with. And we've done this whole beautiful shoot where I become Billy. Oh, the costumes are amazing. I come from a fashion background. I actually studied fashion at St Martin's in the 90s, and I had my own design business for 15 years. I've always really loved the craft of things, but I think there's so much depth to the costumes in Billy Budd and so much authenticity to them. It was workwear, it was hard wearing, it has an honesty about it. They refer not just to the physical tasks that need to be done, but also to the class divide on the boat, which is very visibly obvious. The captains and everyone with a sort of a status role has a tailored costume. They have gold, they have all these details, whereas all the men who are not status, they would all just be in sailors' basic cloth, and you can really feel the difference. Billy would be wearing the most robust, and then you'd have Veer with a very, very beautifully cut glass in his hand. And this idea of cut glass and rough rope really interests me on this tiny world. Well, Billy Budd is obviously set in like 1779, and one of the things I've done was I chose to use charcoal. Actually, again, this was because of my own physical state. And I like to turn up to a canvas and be able to use my body. And I sometimes use a long brush, and I need to be able to kind of attack it. And I didn't feel confident of my hand after the shaking and all of this sort of thing. But they would have had charcoal on the boat. It would have been burnt. And it would therefore not come out in sticks, it would come out in lumps. First of all, it doesn't make marks in a sort of solid, dependable way. Also, it doesn't have a point, you have to make your point. So you keep kind of using this kind of cube, if you like, and the marks that come out are sometimes jagged and rough. They required me digging in and leaning into the work, scrubbing into it. Sometimes it would dent into the card that I was using too much, and you get all these unreliable marks. But it was really interesting, and I kind of enjoyed feeling like I was being quite authentic and true to what would have been a boat experience. I've always been interested in weaving, and just through my own interest I've used ship's rope because it gives a beautiful texture. The production was designed by Christopher Oram, and he too was obsessed by the ropes, which is really quite leading. Originally I was pretty convinced I was going to look at the costumes as my sole inspiration, but then the ropes, which are a huge part of the production and used to delineate social classes and different moments, went into my psyche and became really, really important. It's going to be an exhibition. It's going to comprise of lots of rope, because that seems to be something that really embodies both the idea of tying oneself up and breaking free. They also really reference the rigour of the boat and how there are rules, and knots are very rule-based. So there's so much about safety, keeping one safe, the morals, the rigour, all these things that are embodied within the ropes that are consistently there. Drawing rope and painting rope is hard, so I think there's something about retraining myself physically that's taken me into this kind of knotty realm of figuring out how to make it work again. There's going to be a number of paintings, oil paintings, because I'm a craftsperson. My paintings are done in a very traditional way with rabbit skin and glue and oil paint. The background of all of my paintings is a harlequin, and I start all paintings with this harlequin. I'm interested in societal norms and how we subvert them, and my fixation with the harlequin pattern comes from quite early on in my practice, when I have been looking at the harlequin as the jester, the joker, and a powerful social character from Commedia dell'arte. But when played by a woman, she's considered the trickster. And then I will annihilate that trope through painting another trope on top. So I will paint myself dressed as one of my characters in order to subvert this idea that as a woman, I am the trickster. So the harlequin's kind of at the core of everything I make. There's an awful lot of drawing that's come in, because for the first few months all I could do was draw. The stamp piece that I made at the beginning of the process has rather beautifully come back into play, because now I am able to deal with the stamps, and I've been looking at the word farewell and making a beautiful text piece. Seeing the space that the work is going to go into was really exciting, because it's not a traditional gallery space. It's an exhibition space. First of all, it's round, which is great because it really, again, speaks of a journey. I felt from the beginning that process was key for my response to this. This space is a chance to say, this is my process as an artist, this is what I wanted to respond to, and I'm going to take you through it in a way that is not just showing you my end result, but showing you how I've dived in, what I found interesting. It's called Entanglements, which is a lovely nod to both my engagement in the project and the knots and the ties and the ways in which morality and justice are so intertwined with each other. It's opened my eyes to opera. I'm new to it, and I've sort of fallen in love with it, really. I think as an artist, it's wonderful to respond to something that leaves room for interpretation and room for one's own emotion. I'm absolutely loving it. My practice feels quite developed, and it's always really interesting for something to come along and take me outside of the comfort zone and allow me the space to respond. And Glyndebourne have been incredibly generous in saying, just do it, respond however you want. And in a funny way, the injury was a gift, because it's allowed me to make from a really honest place, being surrounded by this world of Billy Budd, and I was probably very open to it in a way that normal life may not have allowed. I feel desperately sorry for Claggart. I see an angry, damaged man from a time where men were meant to be a certain way, where duty and king and country would define you as a good person, and he was clearly desperately in love with Billy, with no place to put that at that time. And it turned into violence, as it still so often does. And I think that really resonated, this idea of not being able to be who you are and not knowing where to even put that. I can relate to that.